Alright, this is the V-Spot interview. I am doing a third part of my talk with Fabian Nicieza, who's wrote a ton of different comics, as we've discussed before, everything from Cable, Deadpool, X-Force. He wrote Nomad. I mean, it's easier probably to list the stuff he hasn't written. Fabian, how are you doing?
I'm doing well today, Richard. How are you?
I'm pretty good. The last time we were talking, which was months ago, admittedly, we were talking about the Marvel license books. In particular, we were talking about the Barbie book before we got interrupted, which was more interesting than you would think initially.
Than you would have expected, I'm sure.
Yeah, Marvel had a lot of different books then. They really expanded their licensing in the early 90s. Now, you probably...
Yeah, it wasn't so much because they rarely ever made money off of the majority of their licensed books. I mean, it was either feast or famine. That they had G.I. Joe and Transformers, which were huge. Ren and Stimpy, which was incredibly successful for them for a couple of years. But the majority of the licensed books were almost like loss leaders. They did it in order to ensure newsstand rack space and foster and develop more corporate professional ties.
Right.
Because you got to everybody thinks of Marvel nowadays as being Disney owned and being the Hollywood studios, but back then it was very different, and it required a lot more effort on the part of the company to legitimize itself with a lot of other corporate brands.
Yeah. Yeah, that was what I was going to ask you about, because I remember I always heard this, that Marvel was putting out books, basically, they were just trying to, now some people say they were trying to choke out the smaller publishers. Do you think it could have been also that they had such success?
Marvel put out a lot of books, and part of that was certainly to try to consolidate control of the direct market and to not kill small publishers, but really keep them small, The idea is that it's fine if you exist, but we want you to exist at a certain level that we're comfortable with, not at the level you want to attain. But that's completely different than the reasons why they did the licensed books. They didn't do Camp Candy and Barbie and Kid and Play and Alf in order to squeeze out small publishers. That wasn't the game plan for that kind of a program. It really was a young reader program trying to get 6, 7, 8-year-olds to read more comics.
Now, do you think part of it could also be that they had such success in the early 80s with G.I. Joe and Transformers that they really were hoping to hit upon something else like that?
Well, they're always hoping to have a big hit. Ren and Stimpy averaged over 300,000 copies a month in the direct market for 2 years, okay? So it was hugely successful, and it was probably one of the last big successful licensed books that they brought in. Barbie never sold well on the newsstand or the direct market. For 2 years, they had like 35,000 subscriptions for each of the two titles. So, 35,000 in subs alone, nowadays, 35,000 makes you what, a top 50 book,
Yeah.
So Barbie never succeeded to the level they wanted it to at all. Alf was quite a success for a while, too. I think that it averaged over 100,000 copies with the newsstand sales that it got. You have to remember that people very, very conveniently forget that for a long time, even all through the 80s, the newsstand was still almost 40 to 50% of Marvel's revenue base, and DC's revenue base, although lesser to a lesser extent. So Marvel still had to do a lot of things that would enable them to maintain rack space on the newsstand, and it was still a very profitable part of their business all the way through the very early part of the 90s. It all fell apart in the mid-90s, and the price point started to get too high for the average consumer in the newsstand. Not only that, magazines in general started really hurting on the newsstand, so the vendors would prefer to put a candy bar thing or something like that instead of a spinner rack to take up that space in the store.
Okay, now another book you did, and this one that comes to mind because anybody that's listened to the show before knows I would dedicate a religion to Power Rangers. It's just something I just love it. Now, and
I was never a Power Ranger fan. I'm still not a Power Ranger fan. I wasn't a Power Ranger fan when I wrote a few issues of the books. I was really just doing my brother a favor.
Yeah, it's
my brother was the editor of the book, and he wanted to launch it, with a certain amount of internal credibility. So he asked me to write it, and I told him that I would. I think Ron Lim drew some of the books too. Some of the issues.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think unless you're a certain age, like I think if you were born before 1980, you're not going to be able to get into it. It's but what I was interested about, because I always thought that it seemed like a natural to have a comic, but they've tried multiple times and it's never quite seemed to work well.
Yeah, I don't know other companies that have done it or not done it. I know we tried to do it when I was at Acclaim, but by then the brand had already petered out a little bit. Marvel was probably 2 years too late to have done that book. They should have tried to do it earlier, and then it would have had an opportunity to have a G.I. Joe-like success. I think one of the things they found out is that the average Power Ranger fan was younger than they expected. If they thought that a Power Ranger fan might be 9 to 11 years old and would read, I think that what they learned is that Power Ranger fans were really more 5, 6, and 7 and were less likely to read at that point.
And there's this thing where also it had a big teenage fan base, but the thing is, the teenage fan base was closeted. And I remember at school, people would be like, "Oh, do you watch Power Rangers?" They'd be like, "No, I don't watch that." But you couldn't find anybody at 4:30 in the afternoon.
Yeah, no, well, I understood, but there's a good reason why you were closeted.
Except for me, I would admit to anything. I don't care.
You would have gotten your ass kicked if you admitted it.
Yeah, I think I was the only person who would go around it, but everybody, like all the boys and the girls, and everybody clearly did. It is a weird thing where it was like this universal secret. Now, what kind of guidelines, because you mentioned that Mattel would give instructions, were very detailed about Barbie. Did Saban, what type of instructions would they give about the Power Ranger books?
None that I recall at all. I mean, I really don't remember it at all. I don't remember it as being any kind of a problem at all. They were really very simple, basic action-adventure stories, and we weren't trying to do anything. We weren't trying to do anything risque or pushing boundaries. I mean, a book like Barbie is a completely different matter because we were translating something into print for the very first time and giving a voice to a character who had never had a voice before in her entire history as a toy. Power Rangers was different because it was all predicated on stories and character templates that were pretty easy to translate. Ren and Stimpy was more problems by far than anything like Power Rangers because we always wanted to push the envelope on Ren and Stimpy, and that was harder to do with a licensor that was very worried about how difficult a property that was because it was kind of rude and still on a kids network, and they could not curb the rudeness of the creative voices of the cartoon, so they tried very, very hard to reduce the rudeness of the creative voices on all their licensing. So things that the cartoon was doing on a regular basis, we would have to fight to get through. Bubbles in a bathtub indicating that somebody farted, or noxious gases or burps, or some of the eerier stuff that Ren and Stimpy did. We had more problems with. The Power Rangers, honestly, was kind of a cakewalk. I barely remember any of that. I didn't do it for that long. I just did it for a few months for my brother, and that was it. But it was never an issue. We never had any problems at all. I think Saban didn't give a rat's ass about approving it. They didn't care that much at that point.
Yeah, it's it's one of these things you figure that, but sometimes you'll hear about these licenses, and sometimes you'll hear a bunch of where they get a lot of grief just for something you wouldn't expect to be that much trouble.
Look, I first became an editor at Marvel. What year was it? 91 or 92? I don't remember what year it was that I first became an editor at Marvel, and I inherited all of Sid Jacobson's Star books, all the young reader books, and we had like 1 or 2 issues of Camp Candy, the John Candy cartoon, left to go. I think 4 issues had come out, and it was a 6-issue contract. We weren't going to do more than 6, and the last issue of that book was the biggest pain in the ass that I can remember, and I stepped right into it. It was one of the very first things that we had to do in the office when I became an editor. And my assistant editor at that time was Evan Skolnick, and he told me me these licensors are the biggest pains in the ass in the world. I think it was DIC, was the animation company. We just called them the Dick Group. They were making us move the patch on John Candy's sleeve, lower it a quarter of an inch because it's too high on his sleeve. Stuff like that would just drive you nuts. And those are the kind of art changes that they were requesting. And those are books that are nowhere near worth doing because you're not making revenue off of them. So having to deal with a licensor that is that completely incomprehensible and nonsensical about the changes they're asking for and the reasons why they're asking for those changes, it's not a book that's worth doing. So certainly there are licensors who really don't get it, and licensing departments that think they're not doing their job unless they're asking for the most picky unit of changes. But there's plenty of other licensors that do get it and work really, really well with you. I mean, I argue with Nickelodeon all the time on a monthly basis, but it was always for the sake of improving the book, and we had a licensing liaison. She was great, and she was great to work with, and she busted her hump for us, and she fought for us all the time. So it really varied.
I guess it's kind of like when you were a kid or in school, because, when you get older, you kind of realize a lot of the rules adults made were just power grabs, and then there'd be rules you're like, I get that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Listen, and listen, there's also no doubt that you play the game, too. I mean, I'm working with Dan Slott on Ren and Stimpy, and we figure out after the first 6-7 issues, okay, if we want to get A and B and C passed through, and we know those are kind of edgy, well, then we better give them 5 others that are far, far worse, and then they're gonna kill the 5 really bad ones in order and make them think that they've done their job and they feel good about themselves. Meantime, we get through the original 3 that we wanted all along, So it's almost like putting the word fuck into a sentence just because you want to get the word shit through, So we know that they're gonna kill the F word, but meanwhile we're gonna get the shit word through, so it's no problem. We did that all the time, and it's just playing the game.
Now, Marvel also did around this time the Beavis and Butthead comic. How was MTV to deal with that?
That wasn't my office. Yeah, that wasn't my office. That was a different office that was doing it.
Okay.
Yeah, Mike Lackey was writing it. I forget who. Rick Barber was drawing it. I forget who edited it, though. I don't remember who was the editor of that book. It definitely wasn't my office. In fact, it might have even been... Was I still an editor when that came out? Yeah, I think I was still an editor when that came out.
I think it had been around the same time.
Because I had too many books already, and I was really tired of having too many licensed books.
Yeah, I was curious about because I remember at one time Mike Judge. I remember reading an interview with him, and I remember he wasn't really happy with the way the comics came out, or he didn't think they actually translated well to comics.
Well, you know what? I never watched the cartoon. I never read the comics, so I don't care.
Yeah, okay.
It makes no difference to me whatsoever. I was never a fan of that cartoon, so it didn't matter to me.
Okay. Now, I was curious. How did Ron Lim end up on the Power Rangers comic?
I think he loved it and wanted to do it. I think he might have contacted my brother and asked to do it because he loved the characters.
Okay.
He loves all that Japanese, all those Japanese kind of shows.
Yeah, he's one of the. For some reason, a lot of artists, even really good artists, can't seem to ever draw the costumes right, but he was one of the few that actually really nailed it.
Yeah, you know what? I couldn't even tell you. I couldn't even tell you what the details of the costumes are supposed to look like.
Yeah.
I hate to disappoint you.
No, that's okay. No, that's okay. I kind of. No, it's an acquired taste.
It feels like 4 months of my life that I don't even remember.
Right.
It's like totally gone.
Right. Now, if mind if I move around, was it in '97 when Valiant became Acclaim Comics? I know they made the purchase the years before, but they did a big relaunch because I remember being in all the magazines.
Yeah, well, I was hired by them in '96. Okay. Acclaim had bought them, I think, in '95 or '94.
Yeah, '94.
They were really hitting rock bottom when they brought me in, and they brought me in under the expectation that I was going to relaunch the comics, and almost everyone was in agreement that it should not be a relaunch of the same exact characters. Our real mandate was to try to create versions of these characters, of these properties, I should say, that the parent company would have a better opportunity to turn into video games. So we approached almost every single relaunch as both a template for a new comic book series in a new universe, but also as a template for a potential video game franchise.
One thing, I've recently started reading the Valiant books, because I never had, I got up to about 95, and that was about as far as I could get, because the quality kind of dipped. What I was curious about, the thing that surprised me was that I found out Valiant never actually owned Solar or Magnus or Turok.
No, that was always under a licensing agreement with Golden Books, who at that time were the owners of the original Gold Key properties. The comics were published in the 60s under a Gold Key imprint.
Right.
And they got sold. Those rights got sold several times. At that time, when I was working there, Golden Books owned it. I think someone else owns it now. Dynamite is publishing those characters because they have the rights to do them. But it was always a licensing agreement. It was a licensing agreement in perpetuity, I believe, should the publishing continue. So the minute the publishing ceased, I think that the licensing agreement ceased too.
Okay, I was kind of, because when I found out how much Acclaim paid for it, I couldn't believe they just didn't actually buy those characters outright.
I honestly don't even remember what the original numbers were.
Yeah.
I don't even know whether the numbers you heard would be true or not.
It was something crazy.
I didn't have to worry too much about any of the previous Valiant stuff. In fact, I started reading giant chunks of the runs when I first started at the company, because I had not read them at all before that. I read a little bit of the Jim Shooter Solar stuff, but I had not read anything else, because I just didn't care, frankly. I was working at Marvel, and that's what we were doing, and it didn't matter to me that much. But I started to read them when I got the job at Acclaim, and the president and the head of sales told me not to bother, because we're going to be relaunching everything. Is going to be all different, so you don't even have to worry about anything we did before. In fact, we'd rather have you come in with a completely cold point of view, since we all know this stuff, and since we all lived these characters. Keep a completely fresh perspective on it, so that it's not being influenced by anything that was done before. So I started reading runs of Exo and runs of Turok, I think, but I only got about 8-10 issues into each one, and they just said, just stop, so I just stopped, and I didn't read any of them. To this day, I have not read almost any of the original Valiant comics, because my responsibility, as I was hired to do, was to remake all of them for Acclaim, and that's what I did.
All right. Now, of the books that were initiated at launch, one of the ones you wrote, Troublemakers, I was curious about this. Why was there not a Harbinger book? Because that was one of the Valiant's big titles in the first run.
We brought Harbinger back. Harbinger came back as a one-shot a little later on. We wanted purposely to sprinkle a few new properties into the mix to show that the company was capable of creating new stuff. So that's why Quantum and Woody and Troublemakers and Trinity Angels were done. But we planned all along to start to look at some of the other properties and bring them back, and we did that. We brought back Eternal Warrior. We brought back Harbinger. There were plans in place before we kind of imploded to bring back what the heck was that other character's name? I think there's a Gold Key character too, Dr. Spectre or something like that.
That was one of the ones they never actually got around to using.
Yeah, so there were we were doing stuff like there was a bit of a plan to the whole thing. We just did not want to launch all the same properties all at the same time. We wanted to mix it with some new stuff too.
Right, you didn't want it to look like it was just putting a brand new coat of paint on it.
Yeah, and it wasn't, because they were very, very different.
Right.
They tried to do that. They did whatever their big relaunch was the year before I started, the year and a half before I started, which was bringing in a whole bunch of new creative people to work on a whole bunch of their books, and they paid them an arm and a leg, and Dan Jurgens and Jackson Geis and all these other guys came in with these incredible, wild contracts that they got. And the books didn't succeed. And that was their attempt to put a fresh coat of paint on books that weren't succeeding. My job was completely different. My job was to come up with completely new paint, and put it into a can that had a name on it. So the can of paint was Exo Manowar, but it was going to be completely new paint inside the can.
How much of a hand did you have in each one of the reimaginings of the characters? Because the Exo concept was a little bit different than the first one.
It all varied, to tell you the truth. It varied depending. I brought in the creative talent first, assigning them to books based on their interest or my interest, and then they bounced things off me. And in some cases, what they bounced off me, I thought was really strong, and I wanted to go with it. And in other cases, I had to kind of get my fingers in there and dig a little more with them and bounce it back and forth until we could flesh it out. But I think Mark Waid and Brian Augustine came to me with the Exo relaunch concept after they were assigned to Exo, and I really was happy with it. I thought it was different and interesting and still maintained aspects that we could play with from the original. I loved the look that Sean Chen gave the armor. It was a different book, but still a strong book. And I think the first 6 issues of that book were really strong when Mark was co-writing it. The Magnus, I remember we had to do a lot more work on and really flesh it out with Tom Pyre to get it to work. Quantum and Woody amounted to me calling Priest up and saying, I want you to do Power Man and Iron Fist the way you were never allowed to do Power Man and Iron Fist. And he said, are you kidding me? I go, no, that's exactly what I want. And he comes back to me with Quantum and Woody, which was a genius book back then, and deserved all the praise it got. So everything was a little bit different.
All right. Well, one of the things that it seemed like, and again, I haven't been able to read as many of the Acclaim books as I did the Valiant books. This time, there really wasn't a future verse, because that was one of the things Valiant had in the first run, was they had a series of books set in the future, and they had the books set in the present. Did you consider doing a future verse?
I think that after spending as much time in the X family as I spent, I was really sick and tired of Futureverse books and how complicated they make your continuity and how unnecessarily complex and contradictory it can very easily become. So I decided that when we were doing Magnus that we were not going to have it set in the future as an ongoing thing, because I thought that would, A, they did it already, and B, I did not want that to be part of our universe at our launch point. I would rather build to that. There's nothing to say that Magnus couldn't have gone back to the future at issue 25 if we had gotten that far, but I certainly didn't want to start from that standpoint.
All right. Another thing I wanted to ask, with Solar, I don't believe there was a regular Solar book. There was just a few one-shot or a mini-series.
Yeah, we just determined that it was too, and I think the regular series of that book proved it out. It's too big a concept to do as a monthly book.
Yeah.
Almost like Silver Surfer, who rarely has worked as a monthly book. It's too big a character, too powerful a character to really have succeed as a monthly book from a storytelling standpoint. So we thought it would work much better if we launched it as a series of specials like that.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things I noticed when I was reading Solar, because I made it up to issue 20, and after Jim Shooter leaves and they finish up the Unity crossover, it seemed like just a very difficult character to write on a monthly basis, because you can't really have him fight, he can't fight bank robbers, and you really can't keep introducing supervillains that can hurt him while keeping credibility.
And you can't escalate the stories every single arc, so that at a certain point after he's fought God, what do? You know what I mean? I mean, it gets to the point. It's diminished returns when you have a character that's that powerful. And inevitably what ends up happening is you end up depowering him in order to be able to tell stories with him. You know?
One thing that they mentioned in one of the one-shots is that the Acclaim universe was a creation of the original Dr. Solar. Well, not the original, but the original Valiant one, the one that had to rebuild the universe.
Yeah. We were going to tie in the two universes all along, and we were planning to do a big universe-wide crossover kind of thing and bring back all the original characters and have them go up against each other, doing our whole Earth 1, Earth 2 thing. That was all in the works. I think that the game plan was to try to do that in '99. We just never got that far.
All right, were you still around when they tried to bring back when they brought back Jim Shooter to do Unity 2000?
No, I was gone by then. No, that in fact they brought him back after I left.
Okay.
To try to do something. I left in August of '98, I think, was my last month there. And at that point the line was down to just a couple titles, and they were trying to do anything they could to see if they can keep the comics alive. I'm not even sure to this day whether any of those books ever came out that Jim wrote or not. I don't
Two of them
know.
did.
Believe me, listen, outside of the people that I worked with and my caring about their well-being, when I walked out that door, it was the rearview mirror, and that was it. I got into my car and I drove away from Glen Cove, New York, and I never looked back again. It was over. I left on a Friday, and on a Monday I got offered Gambit at Marvel, and I was back to being a freelance writer again.
Let me ask you something about Marvel, because you mentioned the X-Books and the Futureverse continuity, because I've been reading a lot about Cable, and, he's gone through a lot of origins, even before he got an official origin, it seems like. When you started writing the book, what were you...
The problem with Cable is that Rob came up with the character, and it was his idea, and he had a lot of stuff thought through, but not that he shared, and other writers were involved with him, and they started to do their own thing, and then other writers on other books convinced the editor to do other things with the character, which kind of took away a little bit of what Rob's original ideas were for the character. I mean, let me put it this way. Cable was never originally going to be the son of Scott Summers and Madeline Pryor. That was never Rob's original intention. That was kind of forced on him when Jim Lee and Will Spartasio told Bob Harris that they thought that would be a really good idea, and were basically just trying to glom onto somebody else's concept. So as a result, it ended up that the backstory of the character had to be pieced together by everybody's basically trying to reshape a piece of pie after multiple people have stuck their fingers into it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the ingredients that baked that pie, they walked out the door, and you never knew the real ingredients. So anything I ended up doing was well after the fact, and as a result of it already being screwed up. You know, so you know, I'm sure I screwed up plenty of my stuff myself with the character too, but it got to a point where he was off the rails real fast, and I don't think he's ever been off the rails as a character. I think he's an incredibly strong character, and I think I've written him as an incredibly strong character. Where he's off the rails is in trying to make sense and explain his backstory.
Yeah.
That's not the character, though. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The character's screwed up backstory is not a character in terms of what a character does or how a character acts or the reasons why a character does something in your present-day stories, okay? But a character's backstory seems to be incredibly important to a lot of fans and helps justify whether that character has a right to exist or not. So a complicated backstory means a bad character.
Yeah.
And I don't agree with that in the least.
Yeah, I don't
I
either.
think a complicated backstory means a complicated backstory.
Right, you don't have to...
Either you take advantage of it or you ignore it, depending on what your needs of your story are.
Yeah, well, you know, to me, that's always one of the kind of things I like about comics sometimes, when something gets so convoluted. To me, that's kind of part of the fun at times. I mean, I don't want it on everybody, but sometimes it's fun. Like, there was this, me and my friend have this joke, because I was going through a handbook, and somehow Mr. Sinister now seems to have a hand in every X-Men's origin now.
You're talking to somebody who has not read an X comic book.
Yeah, like I said, it's just a funny thing if you're going through backstories.
10, 15 years, I think.
Right, it's just a funny thing.
He had his fingers in Cyclops Pie, and he had his fingers in a little bit in Gambit Pie. That's the most I remember.
Yeah, I think at this point he's in Colossus, Storm. It's just, and to me, it's just one of the things. It's just it's funny or fun to think about.
It can become overwhelming if you try to look at it as a whole, but you have to remember every writer is really only writing it in their own little 3 to 5 year term.
Exactly.
It's like a presidency. You can't look at the presidency as every single person who's ever been a president. You got to look at it as each individual presidency.
Right, and it's one of those things, because I had Jim Starlin on the show, and he said something, when you're working for characters that belong to a company, that you have to accept, there's going to be a lot of changes made.
Yeah, and if you don't realize that going in, that's fine, but you better realize it real fast. And if you think that in any way, shape, or form you have any ownership over the stories that get told of that character after you're done telling them, you're kidding yourself, because you don't. You barely have ownership of the stories you're telling at the time that you're getting paid to tell them, but you certainly have none after you leave. So I can try my hardest to make sure nobody writes Nomad again by putting them in a cryogenic sleep at the end of issue 25 of Nomad, but then I can choose to bring Nomad back and then make the mistake of not putting him asleep again, which leaves it open for the next writer to come along 3-4 years later and decide to kill him in an issue or two. You know what I mean? And so you got no control over that stuff.
Now, is there any Marvel character you wanted to write on a regular basis that you never got to?
Yeah, definitely. There was several. I would love to have written Captain America on a monthly basis. But at the time, I was really writing a lot for Marvel. Mark Gruenwald kind of had real hold and control of that character. I would love to have had a chance to write Doctor Strange as a monthly book. I thought I had a real shot at one point because I was at a certain point in my career where I could make a strong play for a book, and I had an incredibly strong 1-year outline for the character. But ultimately, I think that the editors involved were not the kind of editors that wanted to take too much risk, so I didn't get the book because my storyline would have been pretty risky. It would have been very risky, actually, in a good way, I think. But I didn't get it, so that was it, and I never got another chance again, really. So that's one I definitely would have liked to have had a chance to write on a regular basis.
Now, I know sometimes people don't want to talk about this, but you can tell me if you don't. Can you say what your plan would have been for the book?
Nope.
Okay, because I know... I understand, because sometimes, because I know I hold on to every ideal I've ever had.
Now, my problem is, I have a real problem with writers that talk about what they would have done. I think that's masturbation. I believe that what gets printed between the covers is what is, period. So anything I would have wanted to do makes no difference. Because it didn't happen, so it didn't happen. If it didn't print, it didn't happen, so why talk about it?
During your Gambit run, and sometimes I noticed that Daredevil was popping up sometimes, and you seem to have you seem to be really good at writing him. What appealed to you about that character?
I've gotten to write Daredevil a couple times. I think I wrote one issue of Daredevil, an inventory story that Ron Lim drew that I really enjoyed doing a lot. I got to write Daredevil in a couple of Nomad issues, and I think he only appeared in Gambit once, though, didn't he? I thought he only appeared in one issue.
He was in that. I think he was in that 2-part story. But I mean, I guess it just stood out to me as being so well done.
Yeah, you gotta honestly, I can't take credit for that. If that was all Steve Scroche. I think that he really wanted to do a Daredevil issue, and he really, what Steve did a lot of times, which I had no real problem with, is that I would give him a plot, and I would get back maybe 20% of what I put down in my plot, and he would just take all entire sequences and revisualize them and choreograph them like a director or a storyboard artist would in a completely different way, but never in a bad way. I enjoyed it tremendously because it really kept me on my toes. The Daredevil issue, if I recall, specifically was one of those where he left my beginning and he left my end, but everything in the middle was whatever he wanted to do. And 9 times out of 10, I'd have a problem with an artist that did that, because 9 times out of 10, they don't make it better, but Steve always did. He's an absolutely gifted storyteller. So I never had a problem with it. So a lot of the stuff you may like out of that issue with Daredevil, I guarantee you had to have been Steve's, not me.
Yeah, I believe that was the one with Mob Boss that was getting a heart transplant or something.
Yeah, I haven't read it. It's almost been 15 years I haven't read it, so it's down in the basement somewhere, but I haven't looked at it in a long, long time.
I wanted to move forward to New Thunderbolts a little bit, because, when I was reading the story arc with Zemo and the Grandmaster trying to get the Wellspring of Power, it did not register with me initially that was the same Wellspring from New Warriors.
Yes, it was.
How long had you had that ideal about bringing the Wellspring back?
I had wanted, if I stayed on New Warriors longer, probably a storyline between 70 and 75 was going to be the whole Wellspring story. Not the same way I did it in Thunderbolts, but you would have seen an expansion of that concept. Would have been the return of the Folding Circle. It probably would have been the return of Ty in a very different way. That was going to be my issue 70 to 75 story. But I left the book with 53, so we never got to it. But the ideas that the Wellspring was going to be something that had other touch points in other places across Marvel Earth was definitely something that I wanted to play with, because at that point I'd become such good friends with Mark Grunwald, and we had spent so much time together in the office and as friends outside of the office, that I really started to think a lot about the Marvel Universe and the superhero comics in terms of their connectivity, not the opposite, not in terms of me wanting to be isolated. I really looked at it. I really looked at looking to make connections wherever I could, and through the Wellspring, I thought that there was possibilities to make all kinds of interesting connections. Same thing when I was doing in Thunderbolts. I was trying to do a present-day version of the Guardians of the Galaxy, which would have been established as also having been taken place in the past too. That there was, in ancient times there was a Guardians of the Galaxy, which was people from different races brought together to protect the universe. So I was trying to create those kinds of connections, and Moonstone was going to have, originally have been part of that Guardians of the Galaxy.
Right, and there was the issue you did where you connected a bunch of different characters that used rock or stone as a power source.
Yeah, that's the Guardians of the Galaxy story I was talking about.
Right, that was... I always thought that was really fun, because it gives you enough of a glimpse of the greater Marvel Universe where you want to learn about it, but it doesn't bog down the story.
Well, hopefully it doesn't bog down the story. I'm sure that there's some people at Marvel and some readers who felt it was incredibly bogged down.
Yeah, it's funny though, because you were on the right, you were onto something, because Marvel eventually did that a couple of years later.
With what?
With the modern Guardians of the Galaxy.
Oh yeah, the Dan Abnett and Andrew Lanning book. Yeah, that was different though. They did something very different than I would have. I honestly enjoyed. I read all those issues through trade paperbacks a couple of years ago, and I thought it was an excellent book. I really enjoyed the living daylights out of it. And when Marvel announced they were doing a movie version of it, I wasn't in the least bit surprised, quite honestly, because I thought that entire premise lent itself beautifully to cinema translation. So yeah, no, I would be honest and say that I think Dan and Andy did a million times better job than I would have had I done anything with Guardians further and Thunderbolts.
Let me ask you as a comics writer and you worked as an editor, in your off time, because I know most people start out as fans, were you able to read comics in your off time, or is it something where you didn't even want to look at them?
No, I read, until just the last few years, I read comics really regularly. When I was writing for DC the last 5 years, I was reading all the DC books. I like to stay, when I'm working in a shared universe, I like to stay up on what's happening with the other titles. But I have not read nearly as many comics in the last year or two as I used to, because I'm not writing as many anymore, so I'm just not paying as much attention to it. I recently got an Amazon gift certificate as a present, so I ended up buying a bunch of trade paperbacks to fill in a couple collection runs, like the New Avengers, that I stopped getting the New Avengers comic years ago, but I really wanted to take a look at it again. So I filled out my New Avengers trade paperback collection of the first series that Bendis did. It's hard to keep track of all the different Avengers titles they did, but I'm trying my best to. So I'm going back and rereading those. But I never got tired of them just because I was working on them, And when I was writing for the shared universes, I like to stay up on it. But I'm older now, and I'm not writing almost anything at all anymore. So there's no real enjoyment for me to read books by other people that I wish I could be writing,
Yeah. Oh, let me see here. When you were working at DC, you did the Trinity weekly series with Kurt Busiek.
Yeah.
How was that to work on a weekly schedule? Were you doing what type of scripts were you doing? Were you doing full scripts, or were you doing the Marvel method?
That's a good question. I think we were doing the Marvel method. We were working Marvel method. He was writing the lead story, Marvel method as a plot. I was writing the backup. I'd plot the backup. I'd send him the plot. He would tweak it, and then the artist would draw it. I would do the first pass of the script, and then he would tweak it. It was really his book. I was just helping him because he wouldn't have been capable of doing, 88 pages a month. It's just too much. So I was taking the burden off of 40 of those pages a month by doing the first passes on everything. And it saved a lot of time for him by having me do that, because I was doing the 10-page backups. But it was really his book. It was his story. There was a lot of things about that entire year run that I enjoyed tremendously, and there's a lot of things that I would love to have done differently, because it was his story, not mine, and there's things I would have done differently. That being said, it was tremendous fun. It was really enjoyable to work on all these different characters, to work on a book with Kurt and Mark Bagley. The artists I worked with were all really great guys and really good artists and hardworking guys. So it was really fun. It was like a real professional book. You know what I mean? It was not a great book. It was not going to win any awards, but it was a really solidly crafted professional piece of work that came out on time every week for an entire year.
How far ahead were you how far ahead did y'all have to be on the book?
Well, we were months ahead, but you eat into that time really, really quickly.
Yeah.
So by the time we were done, we always stayed on a good schedule. Mike Carlin was great about that. We got to the point where we were getting stuff out at 3 to 4 weeks from shipping, which is tight. But 3 weeks from shipping is tight, or at least it used to be in the old days. I don't know what it is nowadays, but I think we maintained the schedule pretty well overall. It never got scary, crazy for us that I can recall, and I don't remember ever once being afraid that we were going to miss shipping on a week. Mike Carlin would know far better than me, because he was the editor in the office having to deal with all of it. Him and Rachel Gluckstern had to do all of that stuff. But I don't recall ever being told that if we didn't have something done by tomorrow, we were going to miss shipping. You know what I mean? So I think that we had a little bit of padding all the way through.
How did working for DC compare to working for Marvel in the 2000s?
It's a very different time period. It's very different. It's hard to compare. I mean, when I was working for Marvel in the 2000s, I was working on stuff that for the most part was being left alone. Cable Deadpool and Thunderbolt was stuff that they kind of just sort of knew they were publishing, but didn't care that much that they were publishing. So they just sort of pretended that I didn't exist. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it was fine. I would like to have been more involved in what was going on with other books and stuff, but they didn't want me to be, so that's fine. So I got to do my 2 books for a long, long period of time, you know? Working at DC was different because I was just it was never anything that I had one specific thing that was mine for a long period of time. You know what I mean? I bounced around a lot. I got to do 9 issues of Robin, knowing that I was going to be ending the series, and I love that character, so I would have written that book for 10 years. You know? Then I got to go back and do Red Robin, and I thought, here I'm going to get to write this book for 3 years now, and I'm going to do a good job with it. And then 8 months or 6 months into my second tenure with the character is when they tell us that we're going to be doing New 52. It's like, you know, I never felt I was always given work by DC for that 5-year period of time, but I never felt like I had anything that was mine while I was there. And you know, I wasn't not happy about that, but there wasn't all that much I could do about it either, you know. The times I took over Robin, sales never went down, they were steady. It did not like it climbed into the top 10 or nothing like that, but that rarely happens with books anymore. But sales stayed steady, so I did my job in maintaining the relative successes of the books I was working on. But I never really got to do anything that I felt I felt I could really sink my teeth into.
Now, working at DC, you got to, and pardon me about this, because, my knowledge of comics from, the last decade is very spotty. Your books are probably the only books I regularly bought in the 2000s. But, yeah, your books were the only ones I regularly read, so my knowledge, like I said, just forgive me, it's a little spotty at times. You got to write Superman and you got to write them in Trinity, didn't you? Superman and Batman?
No, not really. I don't remember whether I even got to write them once. They were in the lead feature. I was doing the backup, and the backups were all the other characters, all the other DC Universe characters.
Okay.
And we picked 2 or 3 characters to use as our through storyline characters for the backups. Guys like Guardian and Hawkman. So I got to write a bunch of characters I really enjoy a lot, but I didn't really get to write Superman and Batman that much. I got to write Batman plenty when I was doing Robin, and I got to write the Bruce Wayne Road Home thing. So I've gotten to write Batman plenty, and I got to write several different issues of Superman with Kurt and a couple inventory stories too.
Okay, that's what I meant. Let me ask, because I always ask this, was it intimidating to write Superman and Batman?
No, not in the least. I've been wanting to write them my entire life, especially Superman, so getting the opportunity wasn't intimidating. It was only frustrating that they were always like inventory stories, and I never really had a chance to do a 6 or 12 issue run to really tell a story. And I would love to have had that opportunity, but you know, I get where I'm at in my career at that time, and I get why I'm not being given those kinds of chances. You know, it's a shame because I think that there's a lot of good things I could do with it, but I also understand why it doesn't happen.
To go back to licensing, comics licensing, have you ever seen, because I know you have kids, and have you ever seen a cartoon or something you think would make a good comic, or be a successful comic that's not being made in a comic?
Recently, no, not really. I think SpongeBob would have been a really fun comic if Marvel had done it, or DC had done it. I think SpongeBob's a really strong cartoon. I think Phineas and Ferb would probably make a really fun comic for kids also. I think that there's older cartoons that I think would have made great comics. I think Battle of the Planets would have made a great comic. You really want to go further back to my youth, I think Marine Boy would have made a great comic, and Gigantor, but that's going back a long, long time.
Were there any books that were being, because you mentioned Barbie, how you felt like Marvel didn't really get the most out of considering the subscription sales. Were there any other books Marvel was doing at the time when you were editor that you thought could have been doing better as far as licensed books?
No, honestly, not necessarily, no, because we were getting a lot of licenses that were not necessarily successful licenses in and of themselves. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures and a Hook movie adaptation, which was a disaster, and Kid and Play, and we were trying to do different things without ever really expecting that they were going to be financial successes. We were just trying to get a slightly different market for some of the books we were doing.
How would writing a kid? How was the approach to making a Kid and Play comic? How did that go?
They come to us asking us, expressing interest in it. We meet with them. We get to know them a little bit. We get to see their music and see what it is they're trying to do. I agree that it's a good way to try to reach a different audience. We're trying to reach a young urban audience if we can. I hire a writer and an artist that can do likenesses well because they want to do their likenesses in a cartoon fashion. And then we just met and talked. I met with them, two of them and their licensing representatives, probably like 4 or 5 times in a 3-4 month span while we were crafting the whole book. And basically we were trying to do Archie-like stories, you know, that were just a little more funky and a little more urban, you know, but still aimed at young readers and Archie-like, you know.
Did you ever see the movie House Party?
Yeah, I did. I saw the House Party movies. You know, I not only did I see the House Parties, I got to go to parties with them, and we went to like 2 or 3 different parties that they were playing at and being DJs at and stuff like that. So I got to see them in their element and get to see them interact with adults. We also went to see them at a kids function, so we got to see them interacting with kids. And I just tried to get a feel for their personalities and a feel for what kind of guys they were, so that I could understand how to play them off in Archie-like stories, you know?
Yeah. Is there anything you're working on now in comics?
No, not right now. I just finished 2 stories for the Deadpool wedding issue. That's going to come out, I think, in April. All of us who have written a character in the past got to write stories, and because I wrote him when he originally was created, and then I also wrote him in Cable Deadpool, we did 2 different stories from 2 different time periods. I'll have 10 pages in that book, but right now nothing else. No, not even talking to anybody about too much right now. I may try to see if I can get a couple things happening later this year, but right now I got a full-time job, and that's what I've been focusing on.
With Deadpool, is there a key to writing him to keep him from being too grating to the reader while possibly making him sympathetic while keeping the zaniness?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard for me to say because I have always written him. I've only ever written 4 issues of him where he did not have a large supporting cast of characters. You know what I mean? Yeah. I wrote a 4-issue miniseries with him, and everything else I've written with him has been Cable Deadpool, you know, or Deadpool and a Marvel guest star for that last year. So my way of not having him be grading was simply by not having him be on 20 pages of story, you know? Yeah. There was other things that were being done. There was the Cable had to be given a certain amount of screen time, and the supporting characters needed a certain amount of screen time. So I never felt like I was overwhelming the reader with Deadpool, ever, in 50 issues. I never felt like he was...
He's not break up the...
Yeah, and I got to be honest, I've only read 1 issue of Deadpool since the time they canceled Cable Deadpool. So I read the very first issue of the new book that Dugan and Brian Posen were doing because it was a free digital download from Comixology, so I downloaded it. That's the only Deadpool story I've read in years, whenever I got fired off cable Deadpool, whenever that got canceled, 2005 was it? I don't even remember. 2008? Whenever it was. I haven't read any Deadpool since. And so I have no idea whatsoever what they have done with him as a solo monthly character. You know, I know what Joe Kelly did for a couple of years, and there were things Joe did that I thought were brilliant, and there are things that Joe did that I disagree with 100%. I read a bunch of the runs after that, the Priest run and the Thierry run and the Simone run, and there was stuff that was good and stuff I didn't like, and people will say the same thing about the runs I've had with the character too. But since I stopped writing the book, I have not read a single issue.
Now, to the best of my knowledge, and again, I'm probably sure I missed something the last few years, Marvel's never really done anything with Deadpool and Spider-Man together.
They've just started with each other several times, but not a book together.
Yeah,
I think actually I had Spider-Man in one issue of Cable Deadpool. I think it was probably one of the worst issues I wrote. I thought the idea of the two of them together is far better than the execution, because the two of them together forced Spider-Man to be a straight man, and Spider-Man shouldn't be a straight man. Spider-Man should be the protagonist of the humor in the situations that he gets himself involved in. And when he's with Deadpool, though, Deadpool is so much of a stronger, insane personality that it forces Spider-Man into the responsible straight man role. So it didn't work for me. And I'm sure other writers may be able to find a way to make it work better, but I didn't. I mean, I think that one issue I did was a failure, and I can't say that about too many of the issues I did of Cable and Deadpool, because I thought it was a good book, and I thought I did a good job with it, but that one issue was not good.
I always kind of imagine Spider-Man, after being around him for a few minutes, he's like, oh my god, is this how I am around people?
Yeah, but the thing is, he's not, and he knows he's not. He's annoying, but he's not crazy. There's a difference, you know? So it's good. You know, the only thing I got out of that issue at all is, and I just recently reread them, and the only thing I got out of the issue at all is that he throws Peter Parker off a bridge not knowing that he's Spider-Man, and then pretends that he knew Spider-Man was there to save him. And then like 12, 14 issues later, during the Civil War stuff, is when Peter Parker unmasked himself, Spider-Man unmasked himself on national television, and I had Deadpool with a caption saying that totally gets him off the hook for having thrown Peter Parker off the bridge.
That's a good gag.
Yeah, it waited a year to happen, but it was a good gag.
When you reread your stuff that you wrote, is it possible, or read stuff that you wrote, is it possible to enjoy it on its own, or are you just seeing are you just kind of seeing different mistakes you made?
Both. A little of both, always, to tell you the truth. I had not read a lot of my own stuff in a long time, and then just recently, in the last 6-8 months, I started, part of it was because I was draining out and cleaning up my basement, and I'm trying to organize my comics in my basement, and that includes all the issues of the stuff that I wrote that I got comp copies of. And back in the old days, Marvel used to give you like 25, 50 copies of everything you wrote. 25 copies, it was ridiculous. So I got so many comics in the basement, and they weren't organized, so they were kind of in boxes, but all over the place. So I started to get all the Thunderbolts and put them together, and all the Gambits and put them together, and all the New Warriors and put them together, you know, so that it's a little more kind of controlled. And when I was doing that, I said, oh, you know what, let me grab the first 25 issues of New Warriors. I haven't looked at them in 15 years, in 20 years, and I read them. And I said, yeah, okay, there's a lot of stuff I really, really enjoy here. So let me read the next 25. And I go, there's not as much stuff here. It started to go off the rails a little bit. So then I decided I was going to read some old Thunderbolts that I wrote. And I read those, and I thought there was some good stuff and stuff I didn't like. And then I read the Cable Deadpool, and I found myself forgetting a lot of the lines I'd written, and laughing out loud, which is incredibly immature and rude to laugh at your own jokes, even though it's 8 years later. And read the letters pages that I wrote, and I was amazed that we got away with some of the stuff we got away with. And when I'm actually working on the book, the things that we don't get to do, or the things that we, the storylines that get rejected, or the lines that get changed. Those are the things you think about while you're writing the book. But then if you look at it 5-10 years later with a different perspective, I've forgotten most of what I didn't get to do, and I was amazed at the things I got away with. You know what I mean? So I looked at it with a very different, fresh set of eyes, and I liked it a lot too. So there's a few more things I may grab. I may grab my the Thunderbolts run I read was my later stuff with Grummet, and the Kurt miniseries. I may go back and reread the original stuff I did with Bagley and Patrick Zerker, because I want to give that a look. So after I read my new Avengers trade paperbacks, and a couple masterworks I want to read, then I'm going to go back and read the Thunderbolts.
In the Avengers versus Thunderbolts miniseries, at the end of it, because it had a really good premise, about Baron Zemo, about the idea of whether he was actually evil or good, and it had the end of the series that the final panel had this thing where it showed Zemo's ancestor, and it showed where he had killed somebody or something, showing that the Zemos were never really noble. How did you feel about that when you were doing it? Because it seemed like it was a struggle, because you want Zemo to be better than he is, but you kind of know deep down he's not.
Well, I mean, it was part and parcel to everything I tried to do with Zemo, and I think I did a lot to really build his character in the years I wrote him, and I think I did a lot to build his family in the Zemo Born Better miniseries that I did, and everything with that character was always about being this close to getting it right, him as a person, and never quite being able to do that. So he'll never be Captain America, because Captain America only worries about what has to be done now. You know what I mean? And yeah. Zemo is always thinking so much bigger, but he's incapable of achieving success on such a big scale. So there's a certain bittersweet sadness I wanted about that character. Someone who's smart enough to know the things that need to be done to make the world better, but not good enough to accomplish it. That's kind of sad. That's kind of difficult. And Cable's a very similar character in a lot of ways to Zemo in terms of their perspective on things. They're not the same character in terms of their personality or in terms of their approach, but in terms of how they see a bigger picture, they are. And I like that. And I knew that the minute I was done writing them, somebody was going to bring them back to being just the same old bad guy again. And I heard that it happened because someone told me that he's back to being a bad guy again, and I just shrugged my shoulders and said, so much for 5 years worth of work on a character. But for the time I was doing it, I enjoyed writing him immensely.
Let me ask you about a character because this isn't your character, but it's connected to Zemo, and it's a character for some reason I'm fascinated with. Do you remember the female Baron Zemo from the early 90s?
No, not really.
Yeah, there was a female...
I remember reading, I remember I had to read some stuff about her. That was a Grunwald thing in Cap.
Yeah, and they implied it was...
I don't remember much about her at all. I do remember I had to read some of those issues just to track her and remember her a little bit.
Right, and it was implied at one point that it was actually Heinrich Zemo's brain put in the female body.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Okay, I was curious if you were ever tempted to use that character at some point.
No, probably not. I think somebody had mentioned that to me too, and I thought Zemo's father issues are best played by having a dead father, and I certainly didn't want to have old Nazi Zemo's brain inside a woman's body. That's just silly.
Yeah.
So no, it didn't work out. Listen, I loved Mark. I loved Mark like you wouldn't believe, but I'll be the first to tell you he could do some silly stuff when he felt like it.
Yeah, it's just one of those things, because I was reading about it, and I think at one point Zemo was actually with the female Zemo, and I was thinking, actually I remember in one of the Spider-Man stories, because they had a bunch of little kids in Zemo suits.
I know, I'm blanking out on it because I wanted to blank out on it.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's one of those things, man. That's taking father issues to another level.
Yeah. Yeah, that's too weird.
All right, well, Fabian, thank you for talking to me. I always learn a lot.
I enjoyed it too. I appreciate it. Have a good night.
All right, you too. Let me stop.